So, this test starts way back at industrialization, right? So we were talking about, if you have notes there and you're looking at your notes, we were doing the Reconstruction, and then after we did Reconstruction, we did politics up through Harrison's election. Right? So we did politics up through the election of Harrison in '88. Then we stopped with Harrison's election, and then we said, listen, in the Gilded Age, the most remarkable and dramatic sort of, I don't know if you'd call it event or movement or, activity, I don't know what the word would be. Maybe movement might be the right word, was industrialization. The two big things were industrialization and urbanization. And we said that kind of in conjunction with one another, it resulted in a fair amount of internal development and economic growth during this time period. And so the first thing that we talked about was why. What was the reason that the economy grew and industrialized during this time period, 1865 to 1900? Now, we said there were lots of reasons. There were lots of reasons. And actually, you read about those reasons when you read the Degler chapter, and in there I made you list those 5 reasons why the economy grew during that time period, and Degler identified, in my view, 5 reasons. But one thing that we said was central to that growth was railroads, right? The expansion of the rail network in America from about 35,000 miles of track in 1865 to about 200,000 miles of track in 1900. And so we said the expansion of the rail network was one of the biggest, catalysts to growth. And we really spent some time. We said, okay, how about, how did this happen? I mean, why were the railroads so important? And we said, well, the railroads opened markets, the railroads brought resources in. And one of the things that we mentioned was that rail construction and things relating to rail construction were also influential. I mean, people worked on the railroads. They worked on building the railroads. And that sort of generated some level of economic activity that stimulated, more economic activity. So we talked about the importance of railroads, and then we talked about the role of government in promoting those railroads. And our conversation with that had a lot to do with the transcontinental railroads, the railroads that connected the east to the west. And we talked at length about the Transcontinental Railroad, the first Transcontinental Railroad, the one that connected Omaha, Nebraska with Sacramento. And we talked about the 2 construction companies. And we talked about the role of the federal government. What did the federal government do to promote and encourage the construction of that Transcontinental Railroad and subsequent Transcontinental Railroads? Does anyone besides Jason and myself know? Go ahead, Jason.
I believe they lend money and gave out land.
Yes, land grants and loans. And so the federal government's role in a lot of the construction of railroads involved grants of land. And in the case of some of the Transcontinental Railroad's loans, and then those loans were paid off by selling the land. So we talked a lot about that, and eventually what we kind of argued was that railroads became influential, important, stimulated economic activity, contributed to the growth of cities, had far-reaching events or effects on sort of the culture, the development, the economy at the time. So much so that people began to question whether they should be regulated. Now, at this point, when we started to talk about rail regulation, that's when I said, look, ordinarily, if we didn't have 92 snow days and 15 days off for this, I would have talked about railroad regulation, and I would have talked about a court case called Munn versus Illinois, 1877, and I will mention that today. Munn versus Illinois, the court case in 1877, was influential in this whole notion of railroad regulation. And here's what I guess I'm trying to say. I guess I'm trying to say, look, railroads became really, really important. So important that people said, should this be something that should be left to private industry? Should there be some sort of regulation? And the question was, well, can government just regulate private industry? And the answer was, in Munn versus Illinois, yes. if that private industry is in the public good, like the railroads, the government can regulate it for the public good. Now, the eventual federal legislation that was passed, we did not mention in class, it is mentioned in chapter 25 in your textbook, that was the national regulation of the railroads, was the Interstate Commerce Act.
Sue Maddock, you have a phone call in the office. Sue Maddock, phone call in the office.
The Interstate Commerce Act, which created the Interstate Commerce Commission. Now, after we talked about railroads and the growth of the economy during that time period, we argued that, yes, the economy grew, but the growth was first kind of uneven, unsteady, it was cyclical. And it also involved sort of a transformation in business. Businesses grew in size. We said one of the big phenomena of the time was the emergence of big business. That big railroads emerged, factories that employed hundreds of people emerged, national companies that had layers of management, the growth of big business. And we said the growth of big business was influential. Now, we argued this, that part of the reason that big business grew is those involved with these burgeoning sort of industries attempted to control and consolidate power in trusts and pools and holding companies as a way of controlling price and competition in order to ensure that they would continue to prosper. And we mentioned really three, entrepreneurs that emerged in this time period: Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt. And Carnegie was steel, Rockefeller was oil, and Vanderbilt was railroads. And there were others. And, we talked about the growth of their businesses and the nature of themselves and sort of the controversial nature of how they should be viewed. Were these great industrialists that built these massive industries during these times robber barons, or were these great industrialists captains of industry? And so we talked about the conflict about that, and we talked a little bit about, the steel industry, the oil industry. We talked about Edwin Drake drilling at, in Titusville and striking oil, and Carnegie getting into the refining, not Carnegie, Rockefeller getting into the refining industry. And we did mention that it was Rockefeller who established the first trust, which was a restraint of trade, an attempt to restrain trade, to control competition, to stabilize an industry. Now, remember also we argued that Rockefeller defends this as being something that's good for everyone. And maybe that's true, but it was certainly good for him. And, we talked about Carnegie, and we said that Carnegie was kind of this anomaly. He was this flamboyant, kind of engaging, friendly entrepreneur that built this fabulous fortune and in some ways embodies sort of the spirit of Americanism, and in other ways, like with the Homestead strike, we're not so sure Carnegie was as wonderful as he thought and some of his admirers thought about it. Well, after we talked about the growth of industry, we said, look, as industry grew and the economy grew and it mechanized and it industrialized, this affected labor. And we talked about how mechanization, industrialization, and the growth of big business affected labor. And you read the Degler thing about the dehumanization of labor and, the frustration of labor. And all this, we suggested, resulted in a union movement, attempts by workers to join together for their mutual benefit. And actually, we talked about three kind of unions of unions. We talked about the National Labor Union, which was an attempt to unify workers into one national labor organization. We talked about the Knights of Labor, which was another attempt. And then finally, the AFL, which really wasn't an attempt to unify all workers, but was the most enduring kind of labor organization of the period. Oh, incidentally, when we talk about the Knights of Labor, what leader do we associate? If I were to call upon you, Sarah O'Toole, to identify the leader that we associate with the Knights of Labor, what would you say?